Neil, thank you so much for introducing us, and thank you to Tess and Chris and Carlo, not only for the invitation, but in setting up this event and bringing us into this series of really fantastic speakers. We're really honored to be a part of it and to introduce a little bit about ourselves and our work in this forum. So first, like Neil said, we want to talk a little bit about the Urban Theory Lab and the broader project that we're working on, but we want to point out that while some of the content that we'll present is indeed connected to Chicago and the Great Lakes more broadly in some pretty interesting and deep ways, this is really a talk about method and how we understand visualization for drawing deep relations between climate and the city as both a kind of place and a spatial category. So the talk structure split up into three parts: an introduction as to who we are in the Urban Theory Lab, a definition and discussion of one of our core concepts, critical spatial media, that we're really building our work around, and a very brief look at the end at what critical spatial media looks like in practice in the context of teaching. So back to the question of theory for a moment. Neil often poses this question: why a lab for theory? And we won't go too deep down the rabbit hole, but suffice it to say that theory is really an interpretive framework or a kind of mesh for seeing the world. And it slices things up in ways that allows us to understand certain forms as distinct from others, and then allows those forms to be acted on in one way or another. So in this sense, to harken back to a very old idea of what theory is, coming from Plato of all places, if theory aspires to, quote, carve nature at its joints, to harken all the way back to Plato, then diagrams, maps, and other forms of spatial media become tools for working out theory, for thinking, and not merely for representing. So that's our sort of one of our key tenets with respect to theory. Oh, sorry, guys. So this is particularly important for urban theory, because depending on what theoretical framework and accompanying spatial media that you adopt, you'll come up with very different answers to some of the perennial questions of urban theory and empirical research. So what constitutes urban form? Where and how do we draw those boundaries? What kind of formal process, i.e. space making and unmaking, is urbanization? And these are deeply theoretically laden questions. And Chicago in particular has played a key role as a laboratory for generating and testing the theories of urban form and urbanization. Two examples really stand out that many of you will be familiar with. First, the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, exemplified by Park and Burgess's human or social ecological approach to urban development, growth, and decay in their 1925 publication, The City. And on the right, environmental historian William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, a foundational text for the development of urban political ecology. Now, both of these texts are, in really different ways and very politically charged ways, important for the tradition of urban theory that we situate our work in. But at the heart of each, funny enough, are diagrammatic forms that are apparently very similar and in fact draw from the same source, that really reveal their respective theoretic frameworks to come from a shared foundation. And both adapt the radial and radiative central place theoretic model of land use as developed by von Thunen as far back as the first decades of the 1800s, which is a legacy, a theoretic legacy, I should say, that persists to this day. Now, despite radically divergent political and theoretical commitments of the Chicago School and urban political ecology, the diagram nonetheless persists. And there's something to that. And there's much more to say here, but we'll put it very simply. Urban theory and spatial media have long been dialectically entwined, and we're interested in what happens when these diagrams really run up against the limits of what they can do. And particularly in this moment of planetary climate change, what new forms of theoretical and aesthetic work we need to do in order to grapple with these changes.
And so finally, what about theory in the age of ubiquitous, remotely sensed, big geospatial data? So there's this common refrain today that theory is obsolete because virtually everything can be empirically evaluated by crunching the numbers. And as Neil mentioned before, that sentiment misses the fact that theoretical and ideological assumptions are already pre-baked in the data. So one of our core tenets, again, is to critically interrogate and unpack the underpinning theoretical assumptions, and then to develop alternative critical theories that are needed both to deconstruct these assumptions and reveal new patterns, and forces and dynamics. So the case in point here is the nighttime lights image as a representation of the urban age thesis. So the nighttime lights depicted here claims to show us what human activity looks like on a planetary scale and highlights different intensities and extensions of that footprint. But that becomes troubling because the nighttime lights view of the Earth is a binary one. So it renders the ground as falling into one of two categories, lights, no lights. And that conception of the world is then used and operationalized by policymakers as a proxy for a host of other binary conditions. And most commonly, this is seen as city, non-city, cities versus non-city. And then, but it can also mean people, no people, economic activity, no economic activity, developed versus undeveloped. And then this binary abstracted view, again, seeps back into the real world because of how this data is regularly used to craft and shape global policies. So what we propose is an inversion, so a sort of a perceptual switch, which can be illustrated with the duck rabbit illusion that distinguishes perception from interpretation. So if looking at this image, you only see a rabbit, you would say it's a rabbit, which is perception. But once you become aware of the duality, you would say, I see it as a rabbit, or I see it as a duck, which is interpretation, so interpretive framework. So going back to this image and employing the duck rabbit perceptive shift here, what if we inverse this image and if we look at the world starting from the dark areas? And so we've used this approach as a guiding principle to develop visual strategy for UTL's recent experimental visualization project that you're seeing, called the Data Spheres of Planetary Urbanization. And that was on display at last year's Venice Biennale of Architecture. So the data spheres present an inversion of the mainstream depiction of urbanization, in which cities are depicted as self-propelled engines of economic growth, detached from its so-called hinterlands. Here, the agglomerations are viewed as metabolic black holes. Oh, we don't have that in. Sorry, guys, we thought we have another video here, but we'll just repeat this one. So here the cities are rendered as metabolic black holes, sucking in the resources, and therefore they're rendered as sort of indentations in the landscape. Whereas we have another version of this video, which I can post link to, of various production zones that support urbanization, such as croplands, extraction sites, and those are rendered as actual spikes. So on to our second section, critical spatial media.
So what Durga just showed is a bit of a glimpse into what we mean by critical spatial media. But it's worth drawing out more explicitly what this constitutes and how it's a little bit different than just visualization, for example. So critical spatial media is a concept that we're adapting from recent work in digital geographies and critical GIS, particularly by feminist scholars like Sarah Elwood and Agnieszka Lazinski, who broadly describe spatial media as the mediums or channels that enable, extend, or enhance our ability to interact with and create networked geographic information. So in this sense, we can kind of compare what constitutes spatial media and the relationship to, for example, geographic information and geospatial data to the internet. The internet is not obviously just a browser plus content. It's a networked environment of users, software, hardware, interfaces, methods, data, etc. And from this, we've kind of come up with our own somewhat more expansive working definition. We call spatial media the networked environment of relational technologies, practices, information, and forms of representation by which space, place, location, and mobility, really these geographic elementals, are not only mediated, but produced and reproduced. So in this respect, spatial media can be the object of critical inquiry, like the nighttime lights, for example, and they need to be genealogically and operationally unpacked, understood, and analyzed for the relations of power that they at once facilitate, for example, making policy based on nighttime lights, and encrypt by presenting that as a sort of simple set of observations about facts in the world. But we can also experiment with spatial media for the critical work that they can do as media. So in this sense, they're both tool and object, a medium for critical, theoretic, empirical, and aesthetic practice all at once. So for us, critical spatial media as method sketches out some of the tenets and techniques for a kind of aesthetic pragmatism. And by pragmatism here, we mean a practice of thinking interested in what spatial media do and can do, and not just in general, but to organize experience and how that experience opens up and forecloses ways of collectively imagining how power operates, the modes of sociality and world making that entails. So what does this look like in practice? We're going to show a couple different projects beyond that initial one that are representative of some ways of going about doing this work.
So the first project we'll show here is an excellent example of using spatial media as an object, method, and output of analytical and creative work. It's called In Plain Sight, and it's a 20-minute long geospatial documentary that was part of the US Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Biennale of Architecture. It was actually commissioned by School of the Art Institute of Chicago and University of Chicago. And the overall theme of the exhibition was dimensions of citizenship, asking architects and designers to envision what it means to be a citizen today and to engage with questions of belonging and exclusion at different scales from body to cosmos. So those are different dimensions. And so I joined the team that was tasked with looking at citizenship at the scale of the globe, which we did by interrogating 2 global data sets. And back to the nighttime lights mentioned earlier, that was our first data set, a popular surrogate for a host of variables related to human activity. And the second one, a little bit less known, is the gridded population of the world, which is worldwide aggregation of national census data. So it's compiled at Columbia's Earth Institute. And in this image, each pixel corresponds to approximately 1 square kilometer. And the pixel value, which is shown here in grayscale, corresponds to the number of people living in that square kilometer. So at first glance, these 2 images, they appear to be similar. They are representations of human footprint as understood in the popular imagination. However, a closer look reveals discrepancies between the 2 data sets and demonstrates that neither depicts the actual extent and intensity of that footprint. And so using image processing techniques, we sampled over 16,000 locations where the 2 images do not align. So instances of human settlements residing in the dark and instances where abundance of light was captured, but no people are counted. So in other words, the absence of light does not always mean the absence of people. And so this piece samples and categorizes these quote unquote anomalies using our internally developed taxonomy. And we're seen here at night as depicted through the nighttime lights data set, and then at daytime using the high resolution satellite imagery. And then laid out in a catalog of hundreds of locations across the globe. And on the flip side, the conditions that we shorthandedly labeled as lights, no people exemplify also some of the areas that here at the UTL, we also refer to as operational landscapes. So industrial agriculture sites, natural gas, oil extraction sites, processing plants, surface mines. Again, lights, no people here is a shorthand. So in some of these places, there really are no people, but it often refers to places where the amount of light far exceeds the counted population of that place, or where most people that are present are transient and therefore they do not show up in national censuses, for example, tourist sites. So this analysis enabled the piece to progress as a cartographic choreography, switching between day and night views, shifting scales from the planetary to specific locations, and then narrating stories with spatial data. And I'll show you a short clip that centers on the copper mine in the DRC, shown on the bottom right.
So that's one example of where you can go with this so-called duck rabbit method that we're exploring. And I'd like to show another way of thinking about it that works on what the US military calls the operational environments for its work. So this is part of a project entitled Ecologies of Power, Countermapping the Logistical Landscapes and Military Geographies of the US Department of Defense. And in this case, the Gestalt switch that Gerges referred to is really from sites of open conflict to geographies of what we call the, quote, perpetual buildup and breakdown for war. And in this, we really follow sociologist W.B. Du Bois' insight into World War I that is unfortunately all too relevant right now, that the cause of war is the preparation for war. But what does that actually mean as a spatial method? So what we tried to do was to map US militarism not through the battlefield, but through the vast logistical landscapes and infrastructure through which the post 9/11, quote, everywhere war is waged. So what if we looked at the DoD not primarily as a military agency in charge of waging war, but as the world's single largest developer, landowner, building and equipment contractor, and energy user? What if through that lens, we trace the geographies of militarism through these transitional spaces of demobilization and decommissioning, alongside complementary processes of realignment after decommissioning, preparation, pre-positioning, where militarized, demilitarized, and non-militarized spaces really become inextricable and sometimes even indistinguishable from one another. So we decided to think of this approach, as we allude to in the subtitle, as a kind of countermapping, a term introduced by political ecologist Nancy Peluso, and now widely used by scholars and activists seeking to find more radical agency in mapping that can really empower bottom-up struggles for justice. Countermapping, writes Peluso, is the map-making process whereby communities appropriate the state's techniques of formal mapping and make their own maps as alternatives to those used by government. But to be clear, our project is not a traditional countermapping project, insofar as the DoD is also not a conventional target when you take it as a whole. We ourselves were in fact part of the mass community that we were thinking of taxpayers and citizens needing alternative maps of what we are, whether through ignorance or inaction, tacitly enabling through the money that we contribute. But how do you actually countermap this? The spatial footprint, or better yet, the bootprint of US militarism, so often presents itself not through recognizable maps, but through spreadsheets, reports, organizational charts, other totally unremarkable bureaucratic ephemera that are the result of managing a budget of more than $700 billion over the past few years, bigger than the economy of all but about 20 countries in the world. So we took as a basic premise that this bootprint comes in many shapes, sizes, and media. So the ecology of power that we begin to sketch out was as much an ecology of those media themselves as it was of particular landscape, sites, and infrastructure and the transformations that they were undergoing. So playing these media off each other became a really important part of our investigative method. And to begin, we compared, kind of like Birgit did for In Plain Sight, the base structure report, which is the official accounting of DoD facilities, to an expanded accounting of sites gleaned from contractor reports, journalism, and other public sources of information, to sort of explode what first appears as a primarily domestic, a very much sprawling cobweb of DoD buildings, sites, lands, etc. But even that cobweb is not static. It's instead a historical churning of these militarized, demilitarized, and non-militarized landscapes, airspaces, waters, etc., and a series of overlapping openings, closures, splits, and consolidations over time that, when you aggregate them up, become a spatial index of the shifting forms and priorities as a domestic force of geographic organization and placemaking by the military, and for so many, disorganization and displacement. And where the US has taken on the role of global police, ready to intervene anywhere, anytime, other kinds of spaces come into view. For instance, shown here a selection of critical foreign dependencies and critical infrastructures and key resources identified as extraterritorial defense priorities in the leaked 2014 Department of State cable. Now, they range from the utterly banal, like submarine cable landing sites, where you can really sort of understand why it's in there, to the very much unexpected, like an Australian anti-venom manufacturing facility. And these blueprints really aren't legible at a single scale. So traversing the space from, say, a suburban Virginia interrogation room, to a remote Arctic radar station, to an Indian Ocean atoll base surrounded by a militarized marine ecological reserve, or a missile proving range spanning from Alaska to Hawaii, really becomes this vertiginous exercise in representation. But it's precisely in that telescoping between these scales that are entangled in the militarized production of space that we can begin to pierce the pastel camouflage of the DoD's own maps produced in these static scalar artifacts. And these sort of maps are far from artless self-representation, let's be clear. They're a portrait of contradictions, of ruptures and ongoing struggles at work in rendering, really performatively, a seamless world always already set table-like as the DoD's domain of operations. So we experimented with a variety of modes of critical analysis of media artifacts, hacking conventional forms of representation, and visual narratives to track the transscalar boot prints as they kind of contrive to disappear from view. And these range from breaking down what the military calls the fully burdened cost of fuel, which means the fuel it takes to get fuel to the front, which in the case of the Air Force, for example, is about 85% of its total fuel budget, to a coding of a transcript of a failed drone attack, resulting in scores of Afghan civilian deaths, that tries to parse out the hidden geographies of miscommunication, which are in effect a disastrous game of telephone intrinsic in waging a remotely controlled, not to mention very much illegal war. But where we landed wasn't on sites and spaces of militarization so much, but of so-called demilitarization, exemplified by the more than 10,000 formerly used defense sites, or FUDs, which excludes, by the way, anything beyond DoD's domestic jurisdiction, so leaves out a ton of historical sites. But some local favorites, lest you think this is all sort of somewhere out there. Within 5 minutes of UChicago's campus, Promontory Point, Bobolink Meadow, and the driving range for the golf inclined, all these are part of a former network of Nike missile launch sites. So FUDs were so designated because they were deemed too dangerous to return to the civilian public or to sell off privately. And while some have been sufficiently remediated, at least officially, which would include the ones that are close by, the DoD's remaining to-do list of cleanup runs to about 2085. And 1,000 more sites are under review. Tens and hundreds are added year upon year, following local reporting by journalists, residents falling ill, discovering a chemical seep, or stumbling on an old munitions depot. So in a sense, FUDs are the kind of strange and dark mirror of geographies of conflict. So mothballed fleets rusting in the northern reaches of San Francisco Bay, alien architectures capping off nuclear test sites across the Pacific, islands terraformed into the shape of unsinkable aircraft carriers. But what about those sites that are invisible to our geospatial imaginations that are really awash in satellite imagery? For example, toxic waste dump sites pixelated deep beneath reflective ocean waves. This is off the coast of San Francisco as well, the Farallon Islands nuclear dump site. Or high above in orbit, 35,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, where military satellites are degrading into crumb-sized space junk, hurtling around the planet at more than 7 kilometers a second. Or subterranean burial sites for transuranic radioactive waste bored 2,000 feet into the Earth. Or those, for example, like Hunters Point Shipyard south of San Francisco again, that are greenwashed by new layers of development right under our feet, that add the toxicity of a repeatedly refused, dissembled, or broken social contract atop accumulating chemical body burdens. But ultimately, I want to suggest that these ghostly ecologies of power return always to particular people, bodies, living sites of struggle that, to paraphrase Angela Davis, outline not just these sites of toxicity, but new spaces of solidarity, unpredictable and unlikely coalitions, in her words, thrown together by empire, but never reducible to it. So following the boot prints of US militarism to these linked struggles, in this case of Black and Diné communities, to highlight just one example, emphasize that if the toxic afterlives of militarism persist long and far beyond the violence of the battlefield, no landscape can ever be demilitarized, only decolonized. And these are, I think, the stakes, but also the limits, very importantly, of what critical spatial media can do in a more powerful mobilization. They can lead to unpredictable spaces and to help generate unlikely affinities, but are really only a small part of a much larger collective struggle. But they are in this way a kind of methodological radicalization of our humble duck rabbit. So now I will give it back to Gerga for one final project.
So I'll wrap up this section with a brief overview of my most recent project, which is also in the format of the geospatial documentary. It's about a fairly recent and rapid emergence of catastrophic megafires that are threatening to destroy Earth's forests. And this project seeks to mobilize the storytelling potential of spatial media. So communicating climate change related phenomena can be incredibly challenging because the scales and temporalities involved oftentimes may seem unfathomable. And in that realm, spatial media can serve as a communications device and as a bridge between science, academia, and wider public. So this project uses the medium of animation and sound to provoke a visceral and unsettling reaction from audiences, while at the same time delivering hard data. And so its main narrative line is that fire is an ancient human tool, but it's now becoming an existential planetary threat. And so we've entered the age of mega fires, in which the fire as a tool is backfiring. And at the core of this video is a display of cumulative surface areas destroyed by mega fires in 8 regions of the world. So we're showcasing the tally of burnt areas from year 2000 to 2020 in China, Siberia, the DRC, Brazil, Australia, California, Portugal, and Indonesia. And each of these locations also serve as a narrative lens, exemplifying one particular aspect or category of the megafire phenomenon. And so, besides showcasing the areas affected by fires, these close-ups also reveal cumulative forest loss, greenhouse gas emission estimates, and then they conclude with the zoom out showing smoke plume animations that serve as a transition to the next location. In terms of videography, the piece is conceived as an immersive one-shot circumnavigation of the Earth, zooming in and out of these 8 regions. And that concept allowed us, similarly to In Plain Sight, to develop a choreographed cartographic narrative that moves between scales and continents to illustrate the devastating effects of wildfires. And the sound design also for this piece was important because it follows the cadence of that videography. And so the predictable rhythm of the tallying was also a nice opportunity to make sound more musical and differentiated at 2 scales. So at the continental scale, it's like spacey and vast. And here we were thinking specifically about remote sensing and how it might sound like droning and humming. And then at the sort of close-up view, it's all about sonifying the data. And the volume of the pulse that you're going to hear corresponds with the amount of burnt area in our data set for each year, giving a sense of scale within each site. And I'll show you a short clip. And into our final section.
So these are just a few examples of a couple projects that are trying to use critical spatial media in both the ways that we suggested, both as an object of critique, but also as an experimental medium. And really, we see this as something that dovetails in really important ways with our approach to teaching. So bear with us for a moment while we introduce a few thoughts and then a couple glimpses into the course that we'll be teaching that'll become a yearly offering. So teaching really creates a space of collective experimentation, particularly with critical spatial media and the way that we can build community through that shared method. And pedagogy in this sense is really part of a project of critical literacy for a world that is absolutely saturated with both familiar and unfamiliar forms and operations of spatial media, whether they're coming from a personal arsenal of geolocative smart devices and apps, georeferenced credit card purchasing records, or constant consumption of geospatial data and information through the infinite surplus of visual media. So what we want to suggest through our classes is that you're more than a blue dot on a map, you know that, but how do we actually develop the tools to sort of get there? So without wanting to overstate our case, pedagogy really becomes a space for developing praxis. And by praxis, we mean the reflection and action directed at the structures to be transformed. And those structures that we're referring to here are not just social structures as in the system, but they include what's the object of representation, whether that's militarism or fires, et cetera, but reflexively the increasingly toxic media environments that we inhabit. So that's the sort of broad structure of thought around this. And the first venue in which we'll be exploring this is during the spring quarter through Introduction to Critical Spatial Media. And this course is about introducing these critical theories and techniques that we've been describing, both for visualization of urban and environmental and planetary systems, but specifically amidst these pressures of climate change, urbanization, and global economies of capitalism that are kind of rolled up into one. And the lectures will introduce these major themes and theoretical debates, but they'll be paired with hands-on lab tutorials that will explore a selection of some of the methods that we've shown. Now, thematically, the course will be organized around critical interpretations of the Anthropocene, which is a concept most simply put as human activity-induced geological time unit, according to a fairly recent paper. So in other words, the epoch in which anthropogenic activities are recognized as the dominant force of planetary climatic and ecological change. But again, here the problem of theory returns. How do we choose that epochal dividing line, the so-called golden spike? What consequences will that have? So even in this scientific paper, the authors note that these definitions are going to have effects far beyond geology. Defining an early start date, for example, in political terms, may normalize global environmental change, while a later date may allow us to assign a responsibility to particular countries or a particular moment for carbon dioxide emissions, et cetera. But ultimately, what it does is it puts a lot of power in the hands of scientists, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that needs to be complemented by several other views. So from within the scientific and social scientific disciplines, would we use a metric like urban population growth or global connectivity, or more specific pairings like deforestation and the development of hydrocarbon industries, or the disasters and waste generated by those industries, or the geologic deposition of forms of matter unique to human industry, like radioactive isotopes from nuclear weapons testing, or something as banal as plastic. As each of these alternative metrics is proposed, global representations of the Anthropocene continue to multiply, which again, repose the question, how are we to choose? And our suggestion is that we need more than some of what these theories offer. Could we try to grapple with the current conjuncture through radically alternative images and imaginaries that don't look like globes at all? For example, this piece by Torquaste Dyson entitled The Plantationocene. Where might those paths take us? So in that spirit, critical scholars have proposed a lot of alternatives, and we're not going to go through all of them, but there are 80 at least that have been documented in a paper that we like to use. that highlights these different dimensions, protagonists and antagonists in the Anthropocene. And we take these alternatives as a prompt for the course and an opportunity for a transdisciplinary encounter between geospatial data, critical theory, and spatial media. So the course will move from a critical understanding of how visual narratives of the Anthropocene are constructed, i.e. what kind of media, data, and theoretical frameworks are used, through a selected set of different conceptual paradigms and epochal designations, namely the Urbanocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, and the Pyrocene. And we won't go into what those are necessarily now, but we just wanted to call them out explicitly. So over the arc of the course, we'll try to find out what happens if we explore some of the core data sets used as evidence for the Anthropocene through these alternative lenses. So, for example, what can we do with data showing agricultural productivity and commodity flows if we view them as extensions of the spatial logic of the plantation and racial capitalism? What can we do with data showing the explosive growth of megafires if understood as part of a deeper set of ecological transformations that are entangled with property regimes driven by speculative capital? What kind of strategies and techniques for visualizing those alternative narratives will we need? And we see this as the first iteration of the class. There will be more to come. And in a future version, to shout out Chicago Studies, we want to come full circle from where we began this talk. Go back to Burgess, as dangerous as that might be. And we're really interested to see, okay, how can a critical spatial media approach redraw, reconfigure, deepen, or altogether explode what we take to be the constitutive spaces and struggles of what we call Chicago? What geographic constellations take shape beyond city lines? What new relations, forms of life might come into view as the protagonists of visual narratives of climate change and environmental crisis and the search for reparations for that? What would Burgess's diagram look like if we were to redraw it for those emerging modalities and scales of solidarity? These are really just a few brief questions that we hope that you'll join us in pursuing in the coming months and years. And with that, we'd like to say thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to dive into some questions here. So please feel free to add to the chat and I can be your voice and speak up and ask Alexander and Gorga. But while everyone's adding their questions in the chat, I was just going to ask one myself to kick things off. I guess, speaking of critical spatial media and the point you just made about sort of grounding your work in Chicago, some of it moving forward, I'm just wondering, what are some of the interrogations and questions that you find yourself asking about the Chicago region in terms of critical spatial media?
Well, I can start because this theme of trying to countermap U.S. militarism persists as a very important one for me. And you know, there are places on this campus where famously we're walking right over where the nuclear bomb was invented, right? The Midwest is a sort of vast constellation of silos, logistical sites, and a sort of networked form of this really sort of everyday militarism that, again, as things shifted primarily to the West, west of the Rockies, I mean, has left deeply toxic legacies in the landscape to deal with. So, for example, that would be a place to connect up some of that previous work and those broader accountings of US militarism with much, much more situated struggles for environmental justice. So that would be one possibility. Gerga, do you have any thoughts?
I'm interested in looking at different ecological units in and around Chicago and the Great Lakes region. That would be interesting to explore in future iterations.
Fascinating, yeah. And oh, it looks like we have a question from the chat here. Is the pragmatic end goal for this spatial data to influence policy and action, especially in regards to present climate disaster? Are there any frameworks or examples of how similar such work might more directly inform social action and change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. One of the things that critical spatial media does is it allows us to be very careful about saying what we want the work to do. because it's all wonderful to say we have this vision for what the work will do in the world, and it's a very different thing figuring out how that happens. And as academics, we have a very privileged position to be able to do work that links with ongoing struggles on the ground that activists have undertaken for years and years and years in particular communities, whether that's related to racial justice or the climate disaster or the links between the two or several other sort of ingredients that you want to throw in there. So I think that we want to say that there needs to be a space for us to do some of the primary research, if you want to put it that way, to use this as a critical analytic tool, but then to understand and be inspired by and motivated by work that's going on around us, to figure out where those intersections are and how we can put some of the resources that are made available to us as academics to work in the world. I mean, there are a lot of examples of this, but I'm not sure I want to call anyone out right now, other than the work of a dear colleague of ours who's part of a collective that we founded called Graphy, which don't want to plug too much, but should check it out online, GRAPHE. So Eric Huntley developed a really fascinating tool for use in Somerville, for example, that Somerville and Boston, Massachusetts, that allows tenants to track their landlords across multiple properties, and provides a tool for housing justice that is deeply, deeply connected to these everyday struggles around climate and environmental change, particularly as more and more people are sort of pressed into precarious housing positions along the shoreline, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be one tool that I would highlight. Heard any other?
I mean, just to answer your question directly, yes, that is the pragmatic end goal, and one of the sort of potentials of spatial media is to sort of sometimes flip those on its head. And this is why this is what we're trying to do with this kind of work.
I see another question here. It's a bit of a long one. So your work seems to really emphasize the importance of the senses in the experience of maps. What do you see as being the role of ethnography in critical spatial media? Is this focus on the senses a way of inviting viewers into critical ethnography of mapping practices and urbanization? Or how does qualitative data inform your use of storytelling as a method? Also, was lucky enough to see Plain Sight in person. So cool.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think we too often focus only on the visual aspect of media, and I think it's very important to not just leave the screen, but to engage in all senses. I don't feel comfortable talking much about ethnography in critical, because I haven't studied that much in critical spatial media, but I think there's definitely potential to engage all senses, and I think it's a very good point. The sort of the first one where we did that is with sound, right? Because it evokes emotional and visceral reaction, sometimes much more than images that we're sometimes kind of accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Nina. And I think that's one of the reasons why a Chicago-centric course is something that we really want to develop as well, because it's not just about consuming these geospatial data sets, it's about generating data ourselves and understanding how different those forms of data can be. For example, just the basic difference between qualitative and quantitative data, and what it means to produce that and be aware of its contingency and its deep situatedness, and sort of avoid any of the God tricks of satellite view, but also sort of allow that to link up to and be really deeply informative for these broader theoretical questions. So I think that you could also understand some of the work that we do as sort of leading towards we don't call it ethnography, but there is a sort of a deeply ethnographic dimension of experimentation, of being in the field, but also of the act of reading and interpreting these spatial media and maps. So absolutely.
As we have just about 1 minute left here, I guess the final question that I'm curious about is sort of what shapes your thoughts in this work? Like, how did you get to question the world at this scale? If a student wanted to come to understand the world as you two do, where should they start?
Well, I mean, one of the places that we sort of share is design field, right? And architecture and landscape architecture are meant to be, in many ways, data-driven as much as they are these so-called virtuosic practices of, imagination, which neither of us really believe in. But particularly landscape architecture and the kind of thinking around sort of ecological design and sort of environmental design depend really heavily on data and trying to make decisions on those data. And we sort of have seen firsthand how often those decisions are aesthetic ones that are masked in the language of objective science. And that's not to say that there aren't people who are really doing good work, doing their best to make objective decisions about what is the best design given these data, et cetera. But it also made it very clear to us that there are histories to these data. And if you follow those, they'll lead you into different scales, different spaces. And you can begin to sort of sense what their limits are and what their powers are, as not only bodies of information, but as kind of aesthetic objects. So that would be one thing. I mean, can I just say you should come find out in the class? Is that wrong?
And just a quick clarification to Sarah's question. So I think we found that metaphor. Actually, this was not our guiding principle while we were doing that work, but we found it very useful to elaborate our way of thinking, seeing as versus seeing that. So yes, it can be employed sort of in the scale of what constitutes spatial media, but also just what constitutes geospatial, what constitutes geospatial data. For example, seeing a corpus of videos as of the geospatial data that you can geolocate, seeing sort of like dark places on a map as sort of engines of growth and not the bright spots on the planet. So that kind of perceptual shift can be employed everywhere. I think it's sort of to clarify your question.
Yeah, I think it's an attempt in many ways to identify that ambiguity is a good thing.
Yeah.
That inhabiting the spaces between things can be a very powerful place. So.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful and a very kind of mind-blowing, fascinating session. So I want to say thank you so much to Alexander and Gurga for joining us tonight, and for all of you for hanging out with us on this busy Wednesday evening in the middle of week 8. So thank you all to joining us. And also the recording of this session will be on our website by tomorrow night, as well as all of the other sessions in our Climate in the City series. For those that have been able to join us for every session, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure having all these wonderful climate-focused, Chicago-focused ideas shared throughout the winter quarter. I also, of course, want to plug the other upcoming CIGU events that will be happening in spring, including environment, democracy, and social movements, as well as animals, territories, and environments. And of course, Chicago Studies has tons of fun Earth Week programming coming up, so be sure to keep an eye on the website. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.